to our webinar Foreclosure of Collateral. Today, our webinar is part of a series of restructuring webinars, which we have started to conduct in April and which we plan to conduct by the end of 2020. Each Wednesday, each month until the end of the year, we plan to conduct our webinars devoted to some aspect of restructuring. So today's webinar we will be holding regarding foreclosure of collateral. This is one of the most important aspects of restructuring or pre-restructuring issues which any borrower, any lender needs to take into account while actually considering restructuring. So today, while people are still joining our webinar, I will introduce our team of experts who will be reporting today regarding the foreclosure of collateral. So we will have 4 speakers today and roughly 1 hour and a half to report on various aspects of foreclosure of collateral and various projects and various experiences which we have encountered in Ukraine while actually enforcing security instruments and various security interests. My name is Igor Olohov. I am the head of banking and finance practice at CMS Cameron McKenna Nabarro Olsvang. We will also have our counsel Katerina Chechulina, who will report on specific aspects of foreclosure of collateral. We will also have Olga Schenk, the counsel of our dispute resolution and commercial practice, who will report on specific aspects of enforcement of collateral in litigation and litigation stage. And we will have Christina Korpan, our associate, who will also participate and will describe specifics and general aspects of foreclosure of collateral. So, as I mentioned before, our webinar today is part of a series of webinars on restructuring, which we plan to hold and which we have already held during this year. And as a reminder, we will have our next webinar on the 17th of June this year on the acquisition of assets in difficult financial situations, so distressed assets. And you are welcome to join that webinar as well and to participate with us. Also, as a reminder, we have already held two other webinars in which we describe the topics of restructuring and financial restructurings and influence of COVID on COVID situation, pandemic situation on financings. In particular, on the 22nd of April, we have held as a webinar on debt restructuring, doing it right, and we held it in English, and also a similar one in Ukrainian. So if anyone is interested to see the webinars and to hear them on demand and to receive materials, you will see links in the presentation, which will be distributed after our webinar. And at your leisure, you would be able to hear what we actually described at those webinars. So why we are speaking about foreclosure of collateral and why this topic is important in today's situation? As you know, we live in times of lockdown, the great lockdown as it is known, and the IMF, which assessed the situation, has described this situation as probably the biggest crisis which world economies have encountered during the last 100 years. And the expectation is at the moment that the world economy will shrink by at least 6% by the end of the year. So this is one of the greatest crisis which the world has experienced. And as a result of that, the issues of restructuring of various types of arrangements between borrowers and lenders and enforcement of security instruments, they come to the forefront of discussions today. So I will not stop for a long time on this, but in particular situation of Ukraine, what we need to bear in mind, that Ukraine has entered the current economic crisis in a much better shape than it was before. However, the challenges are still enormous and they need to be resolved. First of all, as you will see from these statistics from the Ministry of Finance and the National Bank of Ukraine, the amount of non-performing loans at Ukrainian banks is very significant. So in the average number is 48% of all the assets which the banks have are non-performing. And this basically means that the banking system, although it is healthier than it used to be in other crises which Ukraine experienced in 2014, for example, or 2008, but still 48% of the loan portfolios at the banks are non-performing. And obviously, the amount of non-performing loans, it is decreasing very slowly because there are several reasons for that. One of the reasons is that most of the non-performing loans are concentrated at state-owned banks. And only recently, on the 15th of April, the Cabinet of Ministers has adopted special regulation which provides for the criteria and for the procedure for state-owned banks to sell their NPLs, their non-performing loans, at a discount and at their net present value. And we didn't have these rules before. Actually, we were fighting for their adoption for around 5 years. So hopefully the state-owned banks will start to sell non-performing loans. In addition, for around 4 years, we already have law on financial restructuring and the voluntary financial restructuring procedures. They have been applied in practice by various banks, primarily also by state-owned banks. Bank was the leader of these financial restructurings. And we see that there is a great demand in such financial restructuring, especially in the pandemic situation which we have today. So hopefully 2020 will be another year of successful financial restructurings under this law on financial restructuring. And I need to mention that its effect of this law was extended for another 3 years last year. So we effectively have additional 3 years of the operation of this law. So why foreclosure if collateral is important? Because in all the big restructurings which we have seen in the last 20 years, foreclosure and actually having hard security for any lender, for any creditor, was one of the key issues which determined either success or absence of such success in the restructuring. So you will see that all these big restructurings which have Ukraine has experienced in the past, especially MRIA, which was one of the probably largest restructurings in the agricultural sector for many years, and that everyone obviously worked in the market in this restructuring. This was a huge landmark project for financial restructuring, and whether or not the creditor had a secured interest or not determined whether such creditor effectively participated or did not participate in the restructuring. So a very similar situation in other processes which have happened in DTEC, in Interpipe, in Metinvest, and those ones which have actually been discussed for many years, but which have not occurred, like Ukraine Farming and Obolon. These have not happened also because some of the creditors, they had secured interests, others did not have, and didn't manage to find a common interest in resolving the situation. So what the pandemic actually has shown us that there are many sectors in the economy which will be very affected by the quarantine, by the lockdown. As you will see from this slide, there are a number of sectors in which businesses have totally stopped working and are not receiving any revenues, like airports or airlines. Many of the hotels and other real estate businesses, they have been forced to stop completely. So all of this it needs to be taken into account while considering restructuring and enforcing your security interests. Again, I would not be expanding further on this. I will just tell you what we are going to cover today in detail during our webinar, and which issues which we are going to describe. First of all, general issues. We will describe what options are available to ensure reliable enforcement in the environment unpredictability. Obviously, although Ukraine is not known as a jurisdiction in which collateral can be easily enforced, there are a number of instruments which are already tested in practice and which have worked and have shown that they are reliable. And if you have taken necessary precautions, these instruments will result in effective enforcement in most of the cases. Secondly, on the general issues, for any enforcement action which you are going to take, it is vital to consider the strategy and to develop a strategy for debt collection and for enforcing your rights. Sometimes, if you prepare very carefully, sometimes very small details of the enforcement issues, like for example, whether a person has a visa to a certain country, or maybe his family is somehow affected by the security instruments, and where the asset is actually located. All these issues, they need to be analyzed for developing a strategy for enforcing your rights. And depending on the instrument which you have, this is one of the things which need to be considered. Also, in a global world like we had before the lockdown, and hopefully we'll have in the future, the right venues where the assets are located, where they are registered, and where they might be moved, and where the assets might be moved. This all needs to be considered in the development of the strategy for enforcement of your rights under security instruments. Then, of course, we will describe what types of collateral can be considered hard, so to say, that can be definitely enforced and that would have less problems with their enforcement. Then we will describe which ones are, in our practice, we have seen that they are softer and they are much more problematic to enforce, although they may look the same from the documents, but the actual enforcement may differ. And we will stop, of course, on the issues relating to enforcements in different jurisdictions and how asset tracing techniques can help with the foreclosure of collateral, and with getting the result, with getting the more successful result with the enforcement actions. We, as CMS, is one of the largest law firms in Europe and now globally. We assisted in many such processes, especially in cross-border enforcement of security rights. And we know from our practice that jurisdictions in these matters, they vary significantly. And it is very essential to actually have very detailed knowledge of the instruments for enforcement of security rights while actually taking such action. Then we will stop on specific issues which relate to foreclosure of assets, such as specific assets like real estate, aircraft, and many other types of collateral. which in which we describe specific experience which we had in Ukraine and interesting cases which we had in this respect. Then we will, of course, stop on the issues which need to be considered before commencing foreclosure of collateral, such as taxation, for example, or general expenses of such actions. On the pros and cons of enforcement methods and their availability, especially in times of the pandemic, and of course some practical observations and problematic aspects and potential solutions for such situations which we have seen in practice. Now, before I pass the floor to my colleagues, to the experts in this area, I want to also mention that because we have done restructurings for many years and because we have a very good network for restructurings and for foreclosure and for enforcement of collateral, we have a multitude of various materials on our website, which you can study after this webinar and freely access. First of all, we have a good guide to restructuring possibilities in Europe, which covers practically every jurisdiction in Europe and describes the principal methods for restructurings in Europe and including Ukraine, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and many other jurisdictions. Also, we have prepared a number of specific research papers on specific aspects of restructuring or waivers or other types of developments which current situation demands. And in this respect, I want to emphasize that we have materials on the measures which were adopted by Ukraine in connection with pandemic. We also have a detailed guide whether the current situation resulted in moratoriums for satisfaction of claims, including Ukraine and in other jurisdictions. And of course, we analyzed whether the force majeure events can be applied to financial instruments. All of these can be actually seen in these materials. And now what we do actually with foreclosure of collateral and what we do with enforcement of collateral. And our role is practically mostly relates to, first of all, advising on the available enforcement options. We, of course, consider practical, documentary and other options which are available to any creditor in such situation, to any lender in such situation. We develop enforcement strategy taking into account the particular circumstances in which a lender or a borrower can find itself and to find a solution for the enforcement. Obviously, we're speaking about restructuring, and in restructuring, sometimes you need to not only restructure the obligations, but you also need to restructure the documents which you have between the borrower and the lender. And this is the core issue which needs to be considered. Maybe there are some novation issues. Maybe there are some other aspects which need to be assessed and a solution needs to be found. Maybe there will be debt for equity swap and other types of transactions. So we always analyze this in a comprehensive manner in order to come up with a good strategy for not only restructuring of the debts or for the enforcement of your secured rights, but also to prepare the right documents to protect the position of our particular client. Then, of course, we also very often we represent clients in courts in relation to enforcement actions, including injunctive reliefs and various measures which help to protect the assets and which help to actually freeze the situation as it is and to find the assets at and participate in enforcement actions on site and working to coordinate execution of an enforcement process. So as you will see, quite a lot of things which we do as lawyers. So our experience is quite significant. I probably would not actually stop for a long time on our experience if you will have this presentation after our webinar, and you will have a look at the type of cases which we led to successful completion and type of transactions which we do. This ranged from enforcement of security instruments to arrests of aircraft and various other types of transactions. And now I pass the floor to my colleagues who will describe the how to develop enforcement strategy and what it takes to successfully have such a strategy.
And hello everyone. As with almost anything in business and in life generally, before starting any project there should be a strategy to follow in order to implement that project. And collateral foreclosure is also kind of a project and not an exemption, so there should be a strategy as well. And this is actually the first thing that we start with when we advise our clients who are considering foreclosure of the collateral. What does it mean? It means that before taking any actions, the creditors actually need to answer various questions which would determine the enforcement strategy, which addresses the following main aspects. Whether the collateral enforcement is actually the only way forward. As they say, a bad peace is better than good war. So it's worth starting with checking whether there is indeed a need in collateral foreclosure, or there are any other options that can be used, like restructurings, and whether the defaults are really crucial or they are minor and likely to be cured soon. And in this respect, under Ukrainian law, for example, a court may actually reject in enforcing the mortgage in a situation where the defaults triggering the early repayment of the debt and enforcement of the mortgage are not that crucial and actually do not impact or cause the damages or losses to the creditors. So this needs to be considered. If there is no way but to proceed with the foreclosure, then next aspect that the strategy would address is actually when to start taking enforcement actions. And while technically it may be quite easy just to make a decision and to send a notice, wrong timing or order of actions chosen may significantly impact the outcome of the foreclosure and undermine the whole process. And this is for many reasons. And the most trivial one is that sending a notice would trigger the count of various periods for further actions, which may actually lead the process into the wrong direction and cause the overall timeline of the foreclosure to be unfavorable. Also, the enforcement strategy would determine which assets to enforce first, or whether all the collateral needs to be enforced simultaneously. And of course, which enforcement method needs to be chosen for each specific security, based on the various considerations which we will discuss further. So while the absence of the strategy is also kind of a strategy, and in some events where the time is of most essence and the actions need to be taken immediately, still we highly recommend that the creditors have a plan, since the right and well thought through enforcement strategy is to a greater extent determines the success of the enforcement. Next slide, please. So what one needs to consider when developing the enforcement strategy. As mentioned, was starting with checking whether the foreclosure is the only way forward. And that would, of course, depend on the nature and viability of the debtor's business, on the source of income, and whether there is a chance to restructure. And for example, where the debtor is the owner of a shopping mall, relying on the lease receivables, a simple reschedule and extension of maturity may be a better option in a situation where the real estate market conditions are not favorable for the sale of the property. There also may be considered an option to sell the debt to the collection company instead of proceeding with foreclosure, because it may be just easier to sell the debt with discount instead of spending a lot of time and efforts on the foreclosure, especially in relation to some specific assets which are difficult to enforce. Also, it is important to understand what is the ultimate purpose of the foreclosure, whether it is to take over the business or promptly recover the debt. And that would also depend on the nature of the debt, whether it is a loan or deferred payment under supply contract, for example. In first case, the lenders would not usually like to take over the assets because it's not their business to run projects, so they would aim at getting cash debt recovery. But for example, if it is a supplier who is a creditor, it may well be happy to get the asset back because it will easily sell the asset to its other clients. Obviously, the availability of the or lack of the debtors' cooperation is crucial. And in most cases, of course, the debtors would not want to assist the creditors in the enforcement, because the foreclosure is usually seen as the last resort that is used by the creditors after all peaceful methods of solutions are exhausted. But still, there may be cases when the debtors may actually be quite cooperative, like for example in non-recourse project finance, when they may just want to leave it to the creditors to solve the issue given the circumstances. Further consideration is to be given as to whether, in addition to collateral, there is some suretyship or guarantee or bank guarantee. In that case, it may be easier, for example, to go for debt collection against the guarantor, which is located in a different jurisdiction with a well-developed and reliable court and enforcement system, especially when the creditors know that the guarantee has sufficient assets. And it may be just easier to very quickly get a freezing order in that jurisdiction and proceed with the debt collection, as opposed to actually foreclosure of the asset of the main debtor in the main jurisdiction. And another aspect also to consider is whether there is any specific order of enforcement of the collateral. And while under Ukrainian law there is no such limitations, there may be some in the security documentation and debt documentation. This is, of course, mainly based on the parties' commercial agreement. For example, in one of the projects we worked on, the parties actually agreed that in case of enforcement, the creditors would go first for the funds, then for the movables, then for the land, and only then for the shares in the debtor. This is, of course, quite a debtor-friendly provisions and not really favorable for the creditors. But in that case, we acted for the debtor, so that was good for us. Next slide, please. Then further focus would be on the debtor itself and its financial conditions generally in order to properly develop the enforcement strategy. It would depend whether there is just one debt or multiple debts, whether those are to the same or different creditors, whether those are secured or not. On this basis, the creditors would have a broader picture and understanding as to what are the insolvency risks in relation to the debtor, and how quickly the enforcement actions needs to be taken, because as soon as the insolvency procedure are commenced, the enforcement would not be possible. And it may also make sense actually to get in touch with other creditors and to see if their interests are common, and maybe joint and proceed with coordinated actions in order to get more favorable result. In this respect, it is also important to understand what are the reasons for the debtor's default, whether they are specific for that specific debt, where, for example, the project is financed and it is just a fail of the project, or whether it's for the reason of overall financial difficulties of the debtor, and then whether those difficulties are due to just improper run of business by the debtor, or because of some market conditions, like, for example, the situations that we have now in the renewable energy sector in Ukraine, or because of the quarantine and COVID, because of the pandemic that we have globally. So that also needs to be considered. And of course, it plays a role whether the debtor is an SPV, and whether the assets constituting the collateral are the only assets of the debtor and shareholders, or there are also other businesses run by the debtor and shareholders, in which case the creditors would could put more pressure on them based on the reputational risk that the foreclosure may have on the other businesses of the debtor. And next slide, please. So moving on, further consideration is in developing the enforcement strategy is to begin to the nature of the debt and collateral that is to be enforced, and for example, whether it is the debt arising under financing or commercial contract, as I already mentioned. In case of financing, whether it is bilateral or syndicated financing, and thus majority lenders' consent and instructions would be needed. And if it is a cross-border financing, that the currency control issues would be involved here. And for example, the creditors may need to consider appointing a local agent in order to represent their interest on the ground and collect the recovery proceeds in local currency. So that would be easier to collect them locally instead of arranging transfer of those directly to the lenders abroad because of the various currency control restrictions. It is also important to understand whether this is the security is granted by the debtor only, or there are also other third-party security providers, and whether those are members of the debtors group or some unaffiliated entities, which also may be the case. And in that situation, it may be useful actually to try to get support from those securities providers, because they, of course, would not be willing that the creditors go first against their assets, but they want to try to put pressure on the debtor. Also, involvement of any other third parties needs to be considered, like, for example, custodians in case of share pledge, or banks in case of funds pledge, and debtors contractors in case of pledge of rights or assignment of rights. That would affect whether any notices or any other actions needs to be taken in order to comply with the contractual and regulatory requirements. Further, one needs to understand what is the structure of the security document, whether there is just one security or several security, what is the ranking, are there any other creditors with the lower priority, because again, there interests would play a role and would determine their behavior and actions, which also needs to be taken into account. Clearly, governing law of the security documents and the jurisdictions where the asset is located is key. And I think the importance is obvious, but just to give an example, CMS acted for one of the clients in the enforcement of aircraft. And while the security agreement was governed by English law, when the creditors and lawyers attempted to enforce the aircraft in Germany, they actually failed to do that. And the reason for that was that the security was held on trust under English law, but in Germany the concept of trust is not recognized. And that's why the creditors were actually rejected in arresting the aircraft. So they had to wait until the aircraft had another flight and landed in a different jurisdiction in order to proceed with enforcement. So the jurisdictions and the governing law is indeed very important for development of enforcement strategy. And finally, of course, one needs to understand whether there are any restrictions on the enforcement, like, for example, prohibition on enforcement of residential property in Ukraine now, or if the statutory limitations have already passed, in which case the enforcement in court would be probably easily challenged by the debtor based on the missed statutory limitations, and so the out-of-court enforcement would be the proper way forward. Next slide, please. As regards the due diligence of the collateral and assets itself, of course, the type and the nature of collateral play a huge role. And with such type of collateral like commodities or funds, the speed of taking the proper actions would play a decisive role in the success of getting the debt recovered and the assets enforced. While with real estate, which cannot just easily disappear, the strategy would be different. But it would also depend on the type of the property. For example, where it is a shopping mall and the continuing operation of it needs to be ensured, or whether it is just a warehouse and it can be just locked and security attached in order to prevent unauthorized access. Also, it is very important whether the collateral is properly identified in the security document, because that would impact both the validity of the security document and actually the ability to identify and verify the assets that need to be enforced. The key is also, and obviously, is the access to the assets, whether it is free or whether it is at all possible to access the assets in order to take possession over them. Further checks when developing enforcement strategy needs to be done in relation to the security documents and perfection, whether all records and registrations were done. For example, in Ukraine, the records on encumbrances in relation to the movable assets are in effect only for 5 years. And after this term, they need to be extended based on the application of the security holders. And if this is not done, then the security still remains in place, but the priority would be lost. So this needs to be checked if everything is in place and the priority is still there. And obviously, the value of collateral needs to be considered. Because how much efforts would be needed in order to enforce the collateral and how much value would be recovered from that collateral plays a huge role. And of course, it is unlikely favorable to start with enforcement of some minor assets with minor value, which require at the same time a huge amount of effort. And next slide, please. Finally, some specific consideration needs to be done also relating to the legal aspect of the enforcement. For example, in Ukraine, the out-of-court enforcement by way of taking over the title over the mortgage would result in the discharge or full discharge of the debt, irrespectively of the amounts that would be recovered from such enforcement. And that would actually mean that the security obligation would be deemed discharged. And even if there were any other security documents, they would be deemed to be terminated. So this is very important to understand in order to determine the order of enforcement of security document, not to lose the available security. Then, as I already mentioned, currency control issues, regulatory constraints, like, for example, the ability of the creditors to hold equity or to own some type of assets like land, whether any approvals are needed, like merger control clearance. And the last but not the least, tax consequences needs to be carefully assessed, since that would affect the enforcement strategy as well. And for example, where a creditor is a non-resident and enforces the collateral by way of taking over the title and then proceeds with the sale of the same, that may actually trigger the withholding tax, and that would of course affect the overall amount recovered. So all of the above is really very important to consider and assess, since this all hugely affects the overall enforcement strategy, and including the order of enforcement and the methods of enforcement. And on the last point, and next slide please, just very quickly on the available enforcement options that we have in Ukraine. So there are basically two options. It's out-of-court enforcement and in-court enforcement. And the enforcement methods are generally the same for both of them. So it's taking over the title or sale of the collateral at private or public sale. For funds, it's direct debiting, and for the receivables, it's assignment of rights. So these are the same for both out-of-court and in-court options. And the difference is only that there is also such method of enforcement as notarial writ, which is deemed to be an out-of-court method of enforcement, and which is only available where the security document is in a notarized form. And so considering which of the options to choose, and next slide please here, it is not a secret that in many cases, in many situations, the out-of-court enforcement would be preferable, because it provides more flexibility to the creditors. It ensures higher control, higher effectiveness, and the recovery of the debt, and it may be faster than to go to court. One of the at the same time, there is a higher risk that the enforcement actions, and actually each and every step of the creditors would be challenged by the debtors. And one of the reasons for that is that in Ukraine, the court practice in relation to various issues arising during the enforcement process are not yet well developed. And so there is room for various interpretation. Of course, out-of-court enforcement would also require more efforts from the creditors and additional money to be put before actually the creditors get any recovery. So additional expenses, including because various service providers needs to be involved, like surveyors or evaluators or security. As regards in-court enforcement options, next slide please. There are of course some advantages in using in-court enforcement procedure, and this is because this is more formal procedure, and actually there are less chances for the debtor to challenge the enforcement, because not all the actions and not all the rulings can be challenged. In addition, for example, in a situation where the debtor refuses to transfer possession of over the collateral to the creditor within the out-of-court enforcement, there is no choice for the creditor but to go to court, because this is what is required under the law then. In-court enforcement may be more lengthy, and creditors may have less control over the process, over the sale of collateral. But a good thing is that we have in Ukraine now the Institute of Private Execution Offices, and the creditors may involve such private offices, and definitely they would be more interested in getting the result, and thus they would be more efficient in taking enforcement actions. And again, which type of the enforcement option to choose would depend on all the considerations we discussed so far, including on which type of the assets are being enforced. Next slide, please. And it's clear that the collateral foreclosure is not an easy task as such, but there are some assets which can be easily enforced. There are some assets which enforcement would be extremely difficult, and that would be mainly determined by the following factors. So first of all, it's nature of the asset and their time sensitivity, like for example, food products. It is also the level of the assets identification in the security documents, and thus the ability actually to verify the assets that need to be enforced in practice. Then it is the location of the assets, whether it is permanent location or whether it is changeable, like for example in relation to transport vehicles. And it is also the various regulatory and enforcement procedure constraint, like for example need to obtain merger control clearance. And on this basis, you can see the various examples of the assets which can be easily enforced, or which we think that are hard to enforce. And of course, of all those assets, the real estate remains probably most reliable collateral, whereas food products and various types of commodities are those which enforcement would be quite difficult, and there would be various complications with enforcement. And now we will actually talk about how to deal with those complications and what are the most frequent issues and which arise during the collateral foreclosure. Next slide, please. So let's address them one by one. The first one is the unknown location of the asset, which may be for the nature of the asset, like transport, or because of the fraud. And to start with, of course, it is part of the exercise on the proper description of the collateral in the security document. And the location should be clearly specified in the security document. And if the asset may be located in different locations in different times, that also needs to be specified. And of course, this won't, resolve the issue at all, but this would still add value in dealing with that. More importantly is that during the performance of debt, the asset needs to be, the collateral needs to be constantly monitored by the creditors, and for that it is recommended to involve professional and reliable surveyors. When it comes to the enforcement, for example, with the transport, the creditors would usually involve state auto inspection, for example, which could help with the search of the transport vehicle and have relevant resources for that. More progressive approach would be to use GPS trackers on the transport vehicles installed at the time of taking the security. Otherwise, the creditors would probably need to involve private investigators and may also consider involving the insurance companies in their investigators to add more pressure on the debtor and add more resources to the search, because usually collateral is insured. Next slide, please. Next issue is lack of identification of the collateral. And while it may be trivial, but quite often this causes very significant issues with the foreclosure. And this may relate to the assets which, like for example, an average person would not even know what that asset looks like. So again, the security document should provide the most detailed description of the collateral with photos of the collateral attached to the security documents, and for example, where it is relevant, with various drawings and instructions for the installation or disassembling of the assets that are subject to the collateral. Because, for example, when the equipment is taken as a security, quite often there is a situation that the equipment is described just as a list of items, but then in practice those items are assembled into a specific machine and facility. And it is sometimes just not possible to identify that following such assemblation. And for example, we actually had such a situation in practice. And the issue was that because based on the description of the collateral that was in the security documents, the creditors' representatives just didn't know what to look for and how the collateral was looked like. So it actually turned out that the collateral was a huge printing machine. And in the end, it was actually found just standing outside, just under the sky. And by the time that was discovered, the collateral was already in improper condition and out of order. And of course, its value was already damaged and not that high, and it was difficult actually to sell it because the use of that asset was not anymore possible. So this is really a very practical issue, and that needs to be carefully dealt with and identified and considered when developing the enforcement strategy. And now I pass stage to my colleague Christina, who will discuss other issues that we experienced in collateral foreclosure.
Thank you, Katya. Igor, if you could please move to the next slide. Yeah, this one, thank you. So the next issue that we wanted to raise is the prevented or unavailable access to the assets. As you know, especially for the pledges of the movable assets, in order for out-of-court enforcement to be possible, for example, such assets have to be transferred into the possession of the pledgee. And if there are any obstacles in obtaining such an asset into the possession, or the debtor refuses to cooperate, which would often be the case, then the pledgee will have to turn to court. And that's why some of the, let's say, solutions that can be proposed to solve this issue is, as we stated, involvement of the security services. Of course, we do not mean this as some kind of use of force against the pledgor or anything like that. But this can be a useful, let's say, psychological tool, because, as you know, enforcement is often dealt with by lawyers, and obviously having just two ladies coming to the office of the pledgor and saying that please give us your assets that are in pledge in favor of our client would not probably work, unlike when you are accompanied by would say, more recent-looking colleagues. If the access to the assets is still not possible and the holding of them is not possible, then another way would be to turn to court to get certain court orders in order to prohibit the pledgor to do anything with these assets, or maybe transfer those to the storage of any third party. Another option is also negotiating with other involved parties, because often especially we are talking about the pledge of movable assets, these assets are stored in the offices of the pledgor, and that's why the source of the premises may be also interested in giving access to those offices to you, given that in many cases the debtor would be also owing some funds not only to the creditor that is currently doing the enforcement, but also to its other counterparties. The next issue is also the third-party involvement. So Katja has already partially covered this one, but often it is very difficult to enforce the collateral when you do not have a cooperation not only of the debtor, but also of third parties, such as, for example, the bank, if we are talking about the pledge of property rights under the agreements, then the cooperation of the counterparties under these agreements, or the cooperation of the warehouses where, for example, certain commodities are stored, and so on. Therefore, to deal with this issue, as we said in the beginning, it is worth paying attention to the relevant provisions in the security documents, which provide for the obligations for the obligor, for the pledgor to, for example, provide proper notices to their counterparties and obtain also the acknowledgement of these counterparties to such notices, to make sure that these third parties, they know in advance that the assets or the property rights that they also are related to are pledged, and they will have to comply with instructions of the creditor at the time of the enforcement. Also, for example, there can be an obligation in the security documents for the pledgor not to amend the provisions of the various agreements with the third parties without the consent of the pledgee. As I mentioned, there should be notices on pledge and acknowledgement received under any agreements that are, for example, pledged or somehow related to the pledged property. Then it is also important to check in the very beginning the pledged agreements themselves to make sure that there are no prohibitions on pledge or transferring of any of the security assets to third parties. And the best way to deal with this in the very beginning would be to include an express provision allowing this specific pledge, or broadly any other pledge or transfer of the asset to third parties. And then the final point is the verification of the debtors. So in this respect, we would recommend to done various kinds of checks if that is possible, in order to accept only reputable debtors only. Of course, that is not always possible in all cases, because sometimes when, for example, we are talking about the pledge of rights under the PPA, that is discussed recently a lot. From the day one, the parties usually already know that there will be certain uncooperation by the guaranteed buyer in case there is an enforcement under this agreement, and there are discussions whether this pledge is at all possible or not. However, in some cases, if we are, for example, talking about the export pledge of rights under export contracts, the creditors have a certain control over which creditors they would, which exporters or importers they would accept, and they can actually check whether these are reputable parties or not. If we can move to the next slide, please. The next point is enforcement notices. The point here is that the delivery of these enforcement notices, the time of their delivery, is also very crucial in terms of various cure periods that would apply upon receipt of the enforcement notices and so on. And also it is very difficult to ensure actually that factually the debtor has received this enforcement notice and to track this delivery. So one of the obvious solutions would be to use the private delivery services in order to have the tracking number of the correspondence and the confirmation from the delivery service that the mail has been delivered to a specific person. And also another way to deal with this is to include specific provisions into the security documents on deemed receipt of the notices. So there are various ways of how to deal with this. For example, to indicate in the agreement that the notice has been received within 3 days of sending, for example, or upon sending by the creditor, it is deemed to be received by the debtor, and so on. And also other general solutions to the foreclosure strategies in general would be, for example, selling this non-performing loan to other creditors. That was also mentioned in the beginning by Katja. Mostly this solution would work better for the institutional creditors, such as, for example, banks, who usually have strict KYC procedures and credit risk checks, and also standardized documents that they use for their security, because the rating of such NPLs would be usually higher. Also, what is in this option, what is crucial to note is that the credit documentation actually allows any transfer of the NPL to the third parties, which would usually be the case in the big financings. And also, it is important to note to whom the sale of the NPL is taking place to avoid the factoring risk in case your counterparty has no right to purchase the NPL. And also another option would be to combine the sale of this NPL with the set-off, because sometimes there are other players on the market who actually owe debts to your debtor, and they might be interested in buying this NPL in order to later set off their own debt against the debt of the of your debtor. And another solution would be to consider the new security instruments that are appearing on the Ukrainian market, and one of them is the security trust, which by its nature is similar to the pledge or the mortgage, but the crucial difference is that the ownership over the asset is transferred to the creditor from day one, meaning that the creditor has more protection in terms and more protection as an owner at the time of the foreclosure. And that's why a lot of steps that are involved in pledge or the mortgage can be skipped in this security instrument. Next slide, please. So moving from this general issue solutions, we would now like to slightly discuss some of the peculiarities that apply to specific security instruments. First of them is the mortgage. And again, as we already mentioned, the first issue is out-of-court enforcement, but by way of taking over the title over the asset. So the crucial point to note here is that you will have to pay attention to the provisions of your security of your mortgage agreement in this respect, because from 2019, the most recent changes that have taken place in 2019, if we are talking about the mortgage with the legal entity, then the taking over the title over the mortgage property will not automatically lead to the termination of the security claims. However, if we are talking about the individual who is the mortgagor, then if you do not include anything into the agreement to the contrary, then the property rights, then your claims to the such mortgagor may be terminated early. The next point is that in case you do not have access to the mortgage property, and you need to conduct evaluation, it is also useful to include into the agreements the provisions on remote valuation of such mortgaged property. Then the crucial point is about the enforcement notices, since the law provides such an option as also, as we mentioned, taking ownership over the mortgaged property. However, and such title can be registered in the immovables register on the basis of the mortgage agreement. However, in order to do that, the mortgagee will also have to provide the evidence that all the enforcement notices have been properly delivered to the debtor. And that's why when making such notices, it is crucial to pay attention to the specific requirements of the law on the notices and how they should be serviced. Next slide, please. Next type of security is funds and bank accounts. So for this security, the bank is basically your best friend, and it is very crucial to set proper relationship with such bank at the very beginning, again at the time of taking security. Because one of the options to notify the bank on the pledge would be either to send a notice or, for example, enter into the specific funds debiting agreement with the bank where the accounts are pledged. Moreover, at this stage, if you have an agreement with the bank, you will be able to actually agree with the bank the ways of how to control the movement of funds on the pledged bank accounts. And it goes without saying that without such a notice, the bank will have no obligations towards you as a creditor in case there are any movement of funds that was not allowed under the pledge agreement. Then there are a few options with respect to how to control the funds on the bank account. One of them is to have a specific amount frozen on the account, but this is not always available to the debtors because they might not even generate revenue yet. Another way, is to control the accounts through giving creditors the access to these accounts, and such products are actually offered by some of the international banks. And we have seen such products being used in one of our recent transactions, where by way of foreign POAs, the representatives of the creditors actually have a say into using the account at certain levels of enforcement. So, for example, after the enforcement notice has been sent, there's a need to pre-authorize any payment going out from the pledged account, also by the representative of the creditor. And also, such controls can be also done by some internal instruments available in certain international banks. However, of course, this entails additional costs, and that's why this also has to be discussed in the very beginning. And then another last point is notice on default versus notice on enforcement. So depending on what is your aim at this stage, it is important to differentiate between these notices because, for example, there is such thing as tax claims and claims based on the court orders, and the bank, even if there is a pledge on the account, it will be obliged to honor the payment demands received from tax authorities and payment demands received from based on the court orders. And that's why it is very important, in case you are already at the stage of foreclosure, to send the notice on enforcement, already directing a specific payment instructions to the bank to make sure that your enforcement notice reaches the bank prior to any other payment document that the bank will be forced to perform, but on the basis of provisions of law. However, if you do not fear any of such conflicting claims to the bank account, there's a possibility to just send the notice of default, and from this time the payments on the account will be frozen, but then you will just have certain time for negotiation with the bank, with the debtor, as to how to recover the debt, maybe in any other way. As to the tangible movables, next slide, please. The point that we have already raised is about the possession over the objects for out-of-court enforcement. So if we are talking about just other movables, such as, for example, property rights or intellectual property that cannot be, let's say, touched, then it is useful to have in the agreement the provisions that will say that these objects are deemed to be transferred into the possession of the pledgee from day one. However, if we are talking about tangible movable assets, then again, there might be, we might also include the similar deemed transfer provisions into the agreement. However, this will have to be very specific in order to articulate that even if you are taking the assets on the territory of the debtor, this would be deemed actually transfer of such assets by the debtor to you, because otherwise, if the debtor refuses to provide you the assets, or there are no such provisions in the agreement, most likely you will have to go to court in order to get those assets. Another point is that even without the agreement of the debtor to provide you the assets, but in case you have access to those, you can take possession over such assets. However, there's a risk that, of course, the debtor will go to the court to sue you that such taking over the assets was not in line with law, because that would have to be voluntarily done by the debtor. However, in this case, you would have to just wait the pluses and minuses of this option, because at least even if you are taking over the assets without the express consent of the debtor, this gives you a chance that you will be able to ask the court to transfer such assets for storage to any third party, for example, or put arrest over such assets, and in such way gain more control over the pledged assets. The next point is unpredictability of the value to be recovered from the movables. So in this scenario, in this point, we would recommend to make, let's say, worst case projections, because in terms of what value you will be able to recover from such movables, because unlike the immovable property, it is often the case that the value of movables can be easily deteriorated, and there is a rapid depreciation of those assets, and that's why even if you conduct a certain evaluation at the time of the start of the enforcement, there is no guarantee that actually by the end of the enforcement the value of those assets would be the same. And plus, it is more complicated to sell the movable assets given that these might be computers or for example conditioning systems and so on, and that's why some of them may not find their buyers. In this respect, you also have to consider your sales strategy, so to sell as just one single asset per buyer, or maybe to group the assets into certain categories that might be interesting to some institutional buyers, for example. And then another important point is about pledge of future assets. These have to be properly identified. So for example, either based on certain value threshold, or on the identified by some certain specific agreement pursuant to which these assets will be transferred into the possession of the buyer. And of course, the monitoring. So throughout all the security period, you will have to monitor these assets. So for example, by requesting the balance sheets of the pledgor, or conducting monitoring by trusted surveyors to make sure that the assets are on site, they are properly recorded on the accounting, and so on. Next slide, please. The next one is the commodities. So this one, this is one of the most, let's say, to some extent complicated assets. And given that we are already short on time, I'll just focus on a few key points, let's say here. So the key point here is the proper identification. You have to have proper relationship with the warehouses where such commodities are stored, and actually have them identified in the pledge agreements, and also have them receive the specific notices from the pledgor informing such warehouses that there are certain rules as to how the commodities of the pledgor are to be stored. Moreover, there should be a prohibition on mixing of commodities. What we mean here is that the same pledgor should not hold its commodities pledged to any third-party creditor in the same storage facility as where it stores the commodities pledged in favor of you as a creditor. because otherwise at the time of foreclosure, there will be a difficulty in identifying where is whose commodities. Another way to solve this would be to have an intercreditor agreement between creditors that want to take a pledge over the commodities. And we had such a case with one of our clients when there was an intercreditor agreement on that. At the time of enforcement, the parties will take 50-50 of the commodities from the storage facilities that were pledged in favor of both of them. And another way to ensure the proper enforcement of the commodities is to have pledge over all assets of the production cycle. So this would be the raw materials from which the commodities are produced, the commodities themselves, then the property rights under the tolling contracts, maybe the pledges under the property rights of the transportation agreements, and so on, to make sure that you do not miss your commodities at the time when these are transformed from one form to another. And changing value of these commodities can be solved by introducing a borrowing base. This would mean that the borrower will be able to draw only a certain percentage of the debt of the loan on the basis of the current value of the commodities. So for example, if the value of commodities is let's say 100 million, then the drawdown can be 80 million only. Next slide, please. Other tools are the pledge of property rights, and the obvious here is that there should be a cooperation with the counterparties. So again, the notices are crucial. Another point is the currency control restrictions. In case, for example, the following the enforcement of the property rights pledge, the parties agree that the counterparty or the debtor will pay directly to the creditor or the third party under such pledged agreement. So it is very crucial to cooperate with the local bank, whether they properly understand this transaction and interpret it as a operations related to the performance of the pledge agreement, rather than just payment, rather than just simple assignment of rights from one party to another, because otherwise there is, such payments may be subject to the 2 million euro limit per year. Another instrument is the participatory interest pledge. This one is highly discussed right now as to whether the out-of-court enforcement is at all possible for this due to the latest amendments to the law on the LLCs. Due to some peculiarities of the wording of that draft of that law. That's why it is very important to have alternative enforcement options included into the participatory interest pledge, or as an option have a clear shareholders agreement pursuant to which an irrevocable POA under Ukrainian law could be issued, in order to ensure that you will not need cooperation of the debtor at the time of enforcement, but you will already have a POA from day one and be able to go to the registration authorities without any assistance needed on behalf of the debtor. Or as an option, there's also a possibility to sign a Transfer Acceptance Act, notarized one also at the time of entering into the participatory interest pledge, which in itself can be a document being a ground to transfer of the participatory interests to possession of the creditor. Or you can also consider options of going to some foreign law instruments, such as irrevocable POAs under foreign law, if there is no proper shareholders agreement. For example, if the shareholder is not a Ukrainian entity. Next slide, please. And finally, on some other securities, in case of pledge of shares, you have to mind that in case you are becoming the shareholder in the company following the foreclosure, besides of the anti-monopoly checks that were mentioned by Katya, there will also be a need to make certain disclosures to the Securities Commission, and that's why it is useful to get legal advice from a good advisor in order to know what new obligations you will gain as a shareholder, or especially if you are gaining 100% control over the company. both for the shares and, for example, for investment certificates, it will be important to have a cooperation of a custodian, also from the very start of the transaction, to clarify which documents the custodian will need from you in order to make an enforcement, to make sure that you have identified yourself properly with the custodian at the very beginning, to make sure there are no problems with the at the time of enforcement, that your signature cards and POAs are all with the custodian. And with respect to the investment certificates, one of the crucial points is also that as a creditor, especially if you are a non-resident creditor, you will need to have a securities account opened with the Ukrainian bank in order to be able to transfer the investment certificates to your account. That's why it has to be taken into account at the very beginning. Or you will have to sell them to any third party that has such an account. And of course, there have to be regular updates to the list of the pledged ICs, because these are often changed, redeemed, and the new ones are issued. And that's why it is important that the most current list of investment certificates is pledged in your favor. I will now pass the floor to Ola. We have like last 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm Olga Schenk. I'm counsel on dispute resolution practice of CMS, and I will devote my part of this presentation to the asset tracing exercise and to the, in particular, to the enforcement of the debtor's assets in foreign jurisdictions. Yeah? And I will start my presentation with the first and the most important questions we need to address in any litigation of the debt collection nature. How actually we are going to enforce the potential court decision or arbitral award against the debtor, and how, I mean here, at the expense of which assets. And we need to understand whether we are sure that we have identified all debtor's assets, or maybe the debtor is hiding something in foreign jurisdictions, something abroad, exactly in order to avoid repayment of his debt for the creditor. And the answer to these questions is very important for two reasons. First, and the obvious one, is the actual enforcement, or putting it simply, getting your money back. And the second reason is also very interesting, because it's determination of jurisdiction in which it is possible and more efficient to sue the debtor, to enforce the court of arbitral award you may have against the debtor, or, for instance, to have to obtain injunction measures against the debtor. This is I'm saying, bearing in mind, of course, that the dispute resolution clause in the underlying contractual documents provides for certain ways to sue the debtor or to resolve disputes with the particular debtor. Well, it is not a secret that in the prevailing majority, if not all, contracts containing dispute resolution clauses, such clauses are drafted so that to avoid Ukrainian courts as much as possible for the reasons that related to, let's say, questionable efficiency of Ukrainian courts. For this reason as well, the allocation of the debtor's assets abroad sometimes, not always, but sometimes, can be used to the dispute abroad and to obtain some more efficient and even easier way to get your debtor and his assets. However, in order to get the possibility to enforce against the debtor abroad, you'll definitely need the asset tracing exercise to be performed, and yearly. Such exercise must be performed already at the beginning when you are just preparing, drafting, and negotiating the contractual documents with the debtor. Here, I would like to clarify just that for the purpose of this discussion, we are considering the asset tracing exercise only in the context of enforcement of debts in civil action, because generally the asset tracing can also take place in financial investigations in order to identify fraud or proceeds of crime or find evidence in criminal proceedings and stuff like that. So for the purpose of this discussion, we are not concentrating on things like that. From the practical perspective, what the cross-border asset tracing and enforcement would look like? Well, successful cross-border asset tracing would involve the following main stages: actually the tracing and identifying assets, then taking available measures on freezing such assets. And here it is very important to proceed with the proper choice of jurisdictions, because different jurisdictions would allow you different procedural tricks and different procedural tools to get the debtor, yes, and actually the actual enforcement of such assets. And while each of these steps critically relies on the previous one, all they are interdependent, and they have one feature in common. They require specific knowledge about the local, factual, and the legal conditions of every particular jurisdiction. And it means that when you start working on the asset tracing, on the suing the debtor, or on this enforcement something against the debtor abroad, you need the international team, and that international team will also include some local councils in all jurisdictions involved. When it comes to the methods of identification of assets, such methods vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and depend on the purpose of such asset tracing. As a matter of practice, usually the initial ones and the obvious ones are like review of public records, review of some registers either available publicly, or a review of some databases either available as well or based on some subscriptions. Another tool for asset tracing, very basic, very initial, would be called HumInt. This is a human intelligence. Simply speaking, this is just getting with local people, very often with journalists, that can provide you with some initial guidance where and how you can look into the debtor's assets abroad. And then some more sophisticated analytical tools and efforts can be taken in respect of such debtors' assets in various jurisdictions. And for this part, the participation of the local legal team can be required, because, for instance, sometimes it may come to some formal actions in order to obtain formal evidence admissible in court, in order to link the assets to the debtor, or doing some other procedural things before the local courts in various jurisdictions. And there's one more thing for which the successful asset tracing exercise can be really helpful in practice. It's like normally it's true that business is not willing to litigate and is trying to avoid any litigation at all means possible. And I saw it in my practice, and so I'm much more ready for settlement or restructuring negotiations if you demonstrate that you have identified its assets and that such assets are under threat. So at certain point, the asset tracing exercise is a powerful tool in the negotiations with your debtor before even starting any litigation or arbitration or formal proceedings that will require some more substantial fees. Could I have a next slide, please? In order to conclude our presentation for today, I would like to say the following thing related to what the overall strategy of the successful foreclosure. First of all, you need a proper formalization of the papers of your documents. Then it is very important to monitor your debtor and its financial condition in order to understand whether it's okay and when you need to take certain actions. Then you need to have a strategy, and you need to have that strategy before you start doing anything. And that strategy probably need to be developed normally and not in a rush. And finally, when you do have the strategy and when you do face a default, you need to act on time in order not to miss any procedural deadlines. So actually, this is all I wanted to present to you during these discussions. And at this point, I would pass the floor back to our partner, Igor Oleho, maybe with some closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ola. Thank you, Ola. As you have seen from our presentation, there are numerous issues, a multitude of issues which relate to enforcement and to foreclosure of collateral. So I encourage each of you after this event to actually give us questions. We will be pleased to respond to anything which you have had or which you have encountered, and to feel free basically to drop us any email or give us a call to discuss any of the issues. You see that foreclosure of collateral and enforcement of security, these are one of the most sophisticated issues in legal practice, and depending on your particular circumstances, depending on how your documents are structured and how you prepared for such a situation, and depending on numerous factors of analysis of your situation and the asset tracing techniques and generally available instruments, you all have to take into account all these factors to determine the right enforcement strategy, the right strategy for foreclosure. Once you actually study all these details and you assess the structure correctly, you will be able to achieve the aims of your enforcement action. So unfortunately, we ran out of time of our webinar, but I encourage again you to join our next webinars on restructuring and on enforcement of collateral and on distressed assets, which will be held in June. And thank you very much for your attention. And we look forward to working on your restructurings and your enforcement actions in Ukraine and in other jurisdictions. Thank you very much.